We're going to be covering events and how to handle events using JavaScript. There's three basic ways to handle events. You can use an HTML attribute like onClick or onMouseOver, and you add that to the HTML element, and that's pretty much what we have been doing up to this point. You can use a DOM property, or you can use DOM methods, and the methods that we use are referred to as event listeners and event handlers. The HTML attribute technique works well for buttons. You can also use it in the body tag, but the problem is that many programmers will put the attribute, like the onClick, onMouseOver, whatever it is they're using, they will put that in a variety of HTML elements. So they don't just use it for buttons and loading when the page loads. And that practice does violate progressive enhancement. And progressive enhancement involves keeping the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript separate. And because of progressive enhancement and the fact that using the HTML attribute technique violates that, it's really not considered best practice for handling events. And so we are not going to be using that technique moving forward. What we are going to be using is either the DOM property or the DOM methods. They are considered best practice. There are a lot of different languages that use event listeners and event handlers. And that is because it's part of the ECMA script standards. So there's an awful lot of client-side web programming languages that use them. And this includes a variety of JavaScript frameworks in addition to languages. So what we're going to be doing is kind of taking a look at the event process and what happens there. And then we'll be looking at the old method, which is the HTML attribute method, and we'll take a look at the newer ways of handling events. So as far as what happens when an event occurs, there's really three different phases. The event itself happens. And basically everything in the browser is an event. So if I just move my mouse from left to right or right to left, that technically is an event. You know, if I point at something, that is an event. Okay, if I click on something, that's an event. So events are constantly happening. Okay, so first thing in event processing is the event happens and the event object is created. Second thing, the event is recognized or it is heard. So we've got all of these events constantly happening, and then one of them stands out and is recognized. Okay, and that recognized event then requires some type of action to be taken to respond to the event, which is the third step. Okay, so out of all these events that are going on, we're going to choose to recognize some of them. And the ones that we're going to recognize, we are going to specify what actions need to be taken. Terminology associated with this is binding, and that occurs when you indicate which event you are waiting for and which element that event will affect. And there's a couple different ways that we can indicate that we are waiting for a particular event. And typically, if we want to specify the element, we usually use document.getElementById because that lets us target a specific element. Event listener. So the event listener is waiting for the event to occur. and it knows what event it is waiting for. So it might be waiting for a click or a double click or some type of mouse movement. Okay? But when the event occurs, then it actually triggers some code to respond to it. And typically, it'll either call a function or it runs through what's called an anonymous function. And you'll see both those techniques. Event handler is the block of code that will run when the event fires. So we have a listener that's waiting for the event, and it's either going to execute an anonymous function or it's going to call a function. And the function that is executed is the event handler. When you create a block of code to respond to an event, you're registering an event handler. Okay, so we've got the listener listening for the particular event, and if the event occurs, it's going to call a function, and then we've already got the function defined. So when we define the function, we are registering the event handler. So let's take a look at how we used to do this up until this point. We would have something like a button, and then we would have the HTML attribute on click or on mouse over or on double click. It depends on what you're waiting for. So in this case, it's on click. And when they click the button, we're going to call change color. Okay, so when it calls change color, it's going to run through this code here. And what this code does is it ends up calling random, which is this little function, and it passes it a number. So it's passing it 255. And then what it's doing with the 255 is it is returning a random number between 1 and 255. And for those of you familiar with color theory, you know that RGB color, the color range is 1 to 255. So every time we go into the random function, it's going to retrieve a number between 1 and 255. And you can see that we've got RGB specified. And this is actually formatting the RGB similar to what you would see in CSS. Okay, so we've got RGB. It's giving us a number between 1 and 255. Got a comma. We have another number between 1 and 255, a comma, and then finally another number. And those numbers are positional. The first one is the value for red. Second one is the value for green. Third one is the value for blue. And then you can see once it's got those colors retrieved, we're using getElementById. We are targeting the ID of colorful button, and we are changing the background color for the button to whatever random color this turns out to be. So here's the example live. And every time I click on this, I am going to get different colors. Okay, if you wanted to see this example in its own file, you can click the link, right-click, and choose View Source. So as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the old way of handling events using the HTML attribute inside our button tag. And we're going to take a look at the newer standards for handling events. First, we're going to look at how to code the event handler using DOM properties. And we're going to be using an anonymous function instead of a named function. And then I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with a named function. So this is very similar to the previous example. We have a button, and here we've got an ID set to colorful button 2. We have the random number function, and it's going to be passed the number 255 so that it retrieves a random number between 1 and 255 to represent red, green, and blue. And that is what is being done here. Okay, and then you'll notice that we're still changing the background for the button to the random color. So what's a little bit different here is we are using a DOM property to trigger the event. So we've got document.getElementById colorful button 2 dot on click. So actually this is also the colorful button. This is the live example. So this is colorful button 2. When I click this, it's going to run through this function. So let me do that. You'll see the function has no name. I mean, normally when you create a function, it's done like the random number one, where you have the keyword function followed by the name of the function. And here, our function does not have a name. So that makes it an anonymous function. Now, the downside to an anonymous function is this is the only place you can really call it. If you had multiple places in your code where you wanted to use this function, it could not be anonymous. You'd have to give it some type of function name. Okay, but if you keep clicking this, you can see that all it's doing is it's going through and getting those random numbers for the color, and it's updating the background color of the button. So that was an anonymous function. Now we're going to take a look at that same example with a named function. So if you use a named function, it's similar to what it was before. We still have the document.getElementById colorful button on click, but instead of setting that equal to the function like we did up here, you set that equal to the function that should be called. Okay, and this is called registering the event, okay, with the handler. So in this case, change me is going to be my event handler, and clicking on that button is going to be the event. So you can kind of see the rest of this looked very similar to what we just had, okay, except for in the previous example, instead of change me, we just used the keyword function, and we did not have a separate function. The function code was immediately listed. Because we are using a named function, we are going to basically call the function, and then once we get in the function, we can process.